and welcome to Let's Chat, a weekly program on American culture hosted by the American Cultural Center Algiers. I'm Emily Walker. Today we have a very interesting speaker for you. But before we get to that, I want to answer a question that many people have been asking us, and that is the American Cultural Center Algiers, or ACCA, open? So no, the ACCA is not yet reopened to the public. We'll let you know as soon as we feel it's safe enough to reopen our doors. We really miss seeing you guys in person. But given the COVID-19 situation, we just don't feel like it's safe right now to reopen, but hopefully we will open our doors in the coming months. So in the meantime, rather than the programs that we offer in the ACCA, we're doing these virtual programs like this one that you're about to hear. But our 4 other American spaces, one in Constantine, Oran, Wargala, and Bashar, those have reopened. So if you live near those cities, I encourage you to seek out those spaces and pay a safe and preferably face mask visit to them. So I'd like to introduce you to our guest, Anela Malik. Anela is the creator of the blog Feed The Malik, on which she shares recipes like white cheddar za'atar sourdough bagels, essays on why people love to hate influencers, and interviews with Black chefs and business owners from in and around the Washington, D.C. area, which is where she lives with her husband and her 2 cats. She has earned a master's degree in Middle East Studies, and she's also very familiar with living abroad and familiar with U.S. embassies. In fact, she began blogging about food while she was posted in Amman, Jordan, as a U.S. diplomat. She's no longer a diplomat, but still she agreed to talk with us here at the U.S. Embassy about her new endeavor and specifically about African-American food traditions. As you may know, February is Black History Month in the United States, and we thought given Anela's commitment to supporting Black-owned restaurants and businesses and her own experiences in a variety of different areas, diplomacy, food, blogging, that she'd be a great guest for us here on Let's Chat. So Anela, I turn it over to you to talk about African-American food traditions. And after that, we'll take some questions from the audience. So for those of you watching on YouTube, you can please ask your questions to Anela in the YouTube chat. You can ask her questions about food, about blogging, about being a diplomat, anything you'd like. But please keep them relatively on topic. So Anela, over to you.
Thank you, Emily. So, مرحبا اسمي أنيلا. واليوم راح أحكي معكم عن الأكلات التقليدية بين الناس السود في أمريكا. I'm going to speak in English because it's been a while since I've spoken in Arabic. But first, I will give you a little bit of my backstory, and then we will move on to talking about Black food traditions or African-American food traditions in the United States. So a little bit about me. I used to be a diplomat. I worked in Jordan, and I have spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East and also North Africa. I've studied or worked in or traveled to Oman, Qatar, Morocco, Lebanon, Egypt. I studied the Middle East in university, and if you can tell by my background, I love the region, and I thought I was going to work in it, and it would be the majority of my career for a long time. But through those experiences, the part that I enjoyed the most was getting to know people and learning about their cultures and histories. So how did I end up talking with you all from Washington, D.C. about food of all things? Well, growing up, food was always the most important part of our day in my household. My parents loved to cook. I learned how to cook from a very young age. And all of our big family traditions involved food. And my father was active in the civil rights movement, and he was also a huge food lover. So he taught me a lot about food and culture, about food and history, Black history, my history when I was a child. And when I began traveling as an adult, and I lived abroad and worked abroad, and even in Jordan when I was working as a diplomat, I found myself always fascinated with food. When you meet someone new, and you're getting to know them, right? One of the most common experiences you're going to have is they'll maybe invite you for coffee or tea, or they'll invite you to their homes, and you will most often end up eating some of their food, trying their cooking, and through that experience, you're going to learn about them and their culture. So I started writing about food and reading about it, and it slowly became my passion and now my career. I focus on telling very personal cultural stories through food. And I have my own blog, Feed The Malik, but I'm also writing a book about Black contributions to American cuisine for National Geographic. So that's who I am, and that's what I do. And now let's talk a little bit about Black food, as it is Black History Month. So first and foremost, what is Black food, right? Black food traditions are the food traditions of African Americans who have immigrated to the United States. And that immigration was both forced and unforced. And it happened throughout hundreds of years of American history, right? African Americans brought their food traditions with them when they were brought to the United States or when they migrated later. And over time, we've created new traditions which incorporate elements and ingredients from our new home, from America, from our communities here, but also do incorporate elements and ingredients from West Africa, from the African diaspora. So that's what I mean when I say Black food. It is a very comprehensive, diverse topic, right? And I do want to make a point that when I'm talking about African American food traditions, I am not talking necessarily about soul food. And soul food is a popular term. It was coined in the 1960s. It came to be used to describe Black food as part of the Black Power and civil rights movements in the 1960s, when Black people in the United States were asserting their pride and their power in their own heritage. But today in the United States, soul food, it does have a stigma. It's often associated with unhealthy foods that are heavily fried or salted. And that is a portion of Black food traditions. It is a portion of soul food, but it's not an accurate representation of hundreds of years of a people's history through food or the diversity of those food traditions. So I don't necessarily want to talk about soul food in this talk, though know that soul food is a part of a broader, Black food tradition. And so when I'm thinking about Black food and thinking about this presentation, it's hard to distill an entire people's food history right into a few minutes. But I would like to emphasize that Black food or African American food, it is American food in general. Black peoples were part of colonial North American society, growing and cooking and serving food as both enslaved and free peoples before America became an independent nation. African Americans worked in all aspects of the food space, and they were everything from laborers in the fields to chefs for our very first presidents, and were counted as some of America's first celebrity chefs. So Black food is American food, and African American food traditions, if you're looking at the historical development of them, they honestly mirror the development of American cuisine in general. So I'll talk about a few specific foods that I think are really emblematic of this view, right, that Black food is American food. First, let's talk about corn, which corn was a staple crop for enslaved Africans in the North American colonies. It was part of their food rations. And it's an indigenous crop that was already present in America when the colonies were founded. And historical records show that the enslaved made corn cakes and breads in a very similar fashion to West African preparations of corn that they used to make in their homelands. So over time, from those very early preparations, cornbread has emerged. And cornbread is now this staple of Southern cuisine. It's widely recognized as one of the most, I think, prominent Southern foods, and some have even called it, the soul of Southern cooking is cornbread. And this is a food that was, it has evolved very little from its early preparations, often by enslaved peoples in America. And I think it's emblematic of Black peoples in the United States taking an ingredient that existed here when they were brought here and making it work, right? That is how foods evolved. It's about proximity. To other peoples, food evolution is impacted by what ingredients are available in a particular space in a particular time. So out of that experience, we have Southern cornbread. And another food I think is really important to talk about and also really interesting is macaroni and cheese. So in early colonial North America, macaroni and cheese was not a common food. It was a food of the elite, of the extremely wealthy, and it was so in Europe as well, right? This was very expensive, these ingredients. So the very first instance that we know of that mac and cheese was served in colonial North America was actually in Thomas Jefferson's household. It was made and served by his enslaved chef, who was Black, James Hemings. Hemings was sent to Paris in the 1700s to train as a chef. And after his training, he returned to the United States. And for Thomas Jefferson, he cooked for diplomats, congressmen, cabinet members, and more, right? The creme de la creme of our early society. And at some of those dinners, he served macaroni and cheese. And so this was the very start of a food that was associated with wealthy, elite populations making its way to the United States. And it was often, like other dishes which have made this same journey, banana pudding is one of them, they were often prepared by enslaved cooks. And over time, as Blacks had more socioeconomic opportunity, as the price of goods went down, right? Pasta and cheese became much more affordable in later decades and generations. These dishes became incorporated into our broader diet in the United States. And today, especially in Black culture, there is no holiday or gathering that is complete without macaroni and cheese. It is considered the anchor dish, the most important dish for any Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's celebration, in addition to some other traditional foods. And I think it's a good example of how even the very wealthy food traditions of early North America were impacted by African American peoples, and we still carry them on today. And then the last food I'll talk about is a really humble and simple food. And in the United States, we call them greens. And in particular, when I say greens, and in Black culture, what we're talking about are tough, fibrous, dark leafy greens like collard greens, kale, turnip, and mustard greens. And so greens are nutritional powerhouses. They're very, very good for you. And they were often grown by the enslaved in their gardens, which they kept either in secret, or often they were allowed to keep gardens by their slaveholders as a way to fill the gap between their very limited rations and their dietary needs. And traditionally in Black communities, we cook greens, we stew them slowly with liquid, and we season them with small amounts of meat, typically pork. Though today, as our conceptions of health have changed over the years, many, many people make them either vegetarian, so with no meat, or we use smoked turkey as a substitute, as many Black people do not eat pork in the United States. That is one of the nuances of our food culture. And so this is a really simple, straightforward dish, which has been, I'd say, ever present in Black American communities since Black peoples were brought to the United States. And it's now considered a staple on a Southern food menu, right? You have to have greens. And we're seeing a resurgence of greens as their nutritional value is really being recognized, and the more modern food trends really focus on healthy eating. And so those are just a few foods that I wanted to talk about. I want to leave most of this open to questions, but to tie it all together, I'd like to say, again, the African-American food traditions, they really are just American food traditions, right? And as food develops, we know that it's impacted by location, by immigration, by imports, importing ingredients, And also in the United States, in the context of Black peoples, is definitely impacted by enslavement, though that doesn't tell the full story of African-American peoples or of the cuisines that we've developed.
Thank you, Malik. That was, thank you, Anela. I don't need to call you by your last name. That was very interesting and very delicious. It's dinner time here in Algiers, so talking about greens, cornbread, and mac and cheese has made me rather hungry. I think I might make some mac and cheese tonight, actually. I'd love to hear a bit about, you spoke about the rich tradition of these dishes. Mm-hmm. How does it play out today in restaurants, particularly in Black restaurants, in Washington, D.C., for instance? I know you're very involved in the food scene in Washington, D.C. So how do these traditional dishes kind of get translated to today?
So, I mean, all of these dishes are staple dishes on Southern food or soul food menus, and you'll see that at a lot of Black-owned businesses in the DC region and throughout the country. So you're always going to get mac and cheese on the menu. It's you're not running a proper soul food restaurant without it. And I would say that hasn't changed that much, though our cooking methods have changed, right? So now it's very common to get macaroni and cheese that has like the crispy top because it's been baked. Whereas previously, you know, it might have been more relying on a bechamel sauce that maybe didn't necessarily have the crispy top. But the big change over the years, I'd say, has been in how various people prepare their greens. And in the earlier food traditions of Black Americans, pork was one of our, staple ingredients. It was readily available. Pigs, were relatively easy animals to raise on the farm. And throughout the generations, and especially since the 1950s, 60s, less and less African Americans eat pork. And that's for a variety of reasons. There was, the Nation of Islam, which was a social political movement in the United States that discouraged its followers from eating pork and also emphasized healthy eating, particularly in Black communities. And as we've seen these like modern health food trends, a lot of restaurants now will make greens the traditional way, right? They'll clean them and strip the stems off and stew them, but they will use turkey, smoked turkey, as opposed to using pork. And that just means that for them, catering to an African-American clientele, especially anyone who comes in, unless they're vegetarian, will be able to purchase and eat there. And often now you'll also see vegetarian versions of greens on menus as well.
I like that. I'm a vegetarian myself, although actually a new pescatarian, but I love greens. So I'm always checking to see if there's ham in them, and happy to hear that some people are making them vegetarian. So there's a lot of discussion going on in the YouTube chat right now. Food is a controversial topic. And I think American food is a controversial topic. Algerians, unsurprisingly, have a great fondness for their own cuisine, for Algerian food. They love Algerian food, understandably. Algerian food is delicious. And they seem to have an opinion, some people expressing their opinion in the YouTube chat, that American food is not good, that Americans call anything we can put in our mouth food. That was one comment. And my thought is that this bad perception of American food kind of comes from lots of times in other countries, the only view other people have of American food are some fast food restaurants that are open. So there's the idea that American food is just like hot dogs and hamburgers, maybe. That's me slightly defending American food, but Anela, I'm interested what your take is on this. You've lived abroad. What do you think perceptions of American food are, and are they accurate?
So I do think that perceptions of American food abroad are really informed by fast food, like you said. And I, as someone who I explore food whenever I travel, that's usually the purpose of my trips. I've seen that play out over and over where people think hamburgers and hot dogs are quintessential American cuisine. And I would say that that's only like a small sliver of the picture, right? Just as we would never say that French food is only cheese. A lot of people are like, oh, the French eat a lot of cheese, but that's a small just a small picture of their cuisine. And so within the United States, if the audience thinks about how large the United States is, right? It's 50 states, and some of those states are larger than most countries. So we have so many different food regions. In the coastal areas, you're going to find a lot of fresh seafood, for example. In the mid-Atlantic, which is where I live in DC, it's great because it's relatively close to the coast, but you'll also get a lot of really fresh fruits and vegetables here as well. And so depending on where you go in the United States, you can get anything from soup made from blue crabs in Maryland, which is, popular ingredient here. Crabs, when they're in season, are hugely popular, to when you go into Southern California or the Southwest, you're going to find a lot of food that has flavors and influences from Mexico and South America, for example. And so I wish that other people got to experience that part of American food, how diverse it is and how many different, frankly, immigrant influences there are within the United States that have definitely impacted our food. We draw from Spanish, Italian, Polish, Mexican, and even Caribbean and African influences in our cuisines.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, those are all really good points. It's just really hard to express to people maybe who haven't lived in the United States how vast it is and really just how different the food is, as you said. I mean, I grew up in outside of Detroit. There's lots of Arab Americans in Detroit. So we grew up eating lots of Lebanese food. That was a very popular Lebanese food and Iraqi food. There's a pretty big Mexican population in Detroit. So we ate Mexican food because of that. There's a big Polish population. So I grew up eating pierogies, one of my favorite foods. And because my family is of Scottish origins, ancestral origins, we have our specific Scottish foods we eat, like a hard-boiled egg wrapped in sausage. My mom would make that vegetarian sausage for me, but Scotch egg. So it's so specific. It's so regional. You mentioned some of the regional differences that are in Washington, D.C., or the regional delicacies that are there. The blue crab from Maryland. Ben's Chili Bowl is something in Washington, D.C., a Black-owned restaurant that's been there since the 1950s. Obama ate there.
Everyone goes there,
goes there. That's a DC institution. Also, could you just quickly touch on, I saw something you wrote about on your blog. There's something in DC called Mambo Sauce. And I don't think anyone outside of DC knows what it is. Just as an example of how specific and regional these food traditions are. What is Mambo Sauce?
So Mambo Sauce is, I don't know how to describe it. It's like a sweet-ish barbecue sauce almost. And it's usually bright red in color. And it's a staple of these very small carry-out only restaurants in DC. And when I say carry-out only, I mean that typically it's a very small space. You walk in and you order from the counter, and then there's nowhere to sit. You wait to get your food, and then you take it home. So you're carrying it out. That's why we call it that. And in DC, Mambo Sauce is something that, especially people in the Black community, grew up eating, typically on chicken. So you'd get your chicken wings and then you'd get Mambo Sauce. And that was like, that was your order, that was your thing. And now, today we're seeing kind of a resurgence of Mambo Sauce in DC. Chefs are making their own versions and putting it on their menus at fancy restaurants. We have a few local companies that are selling it in stores. And it is like I would call it almost a regional barbecue sauce.
Mm-hmm. Regional barbecue sauce. Good way to explain it. Well, on that point, you just mentioned, you interviewed the people who started a Mambo Sauce company, yes, and you do lots of interviews with Black chefs and Black business people in DC. Could you talk about why that is so important to you? Why it's important to you to support Black-owned businesses?
Okay, let's see if I can do this in less than 5 minutes. So, because I think this is an important point that not only, your audience in Algiers, but every audience that I talk to asks this question, and it's really important to explain it, I think, in a way that's clear. So we know that Black peoples were brought to America and the initial populations were enslaved, right? after they were freed, after emancipation, we're looking at a population that was then for decades and generations, and to this day still struggles with this, was systematically discriminated against and excluded. And this discrimination touched on everything from education and housing policies, the ability to get loans for businesses, all sorts of factors, right? So what that has created today is a society where Black peoples hold very little wealth, and wealth is concentrated, in other populations in the United States. And we also see that there are still some institutional barriers that prevent Black peoples from accessing the same services, the same, for example, in the restaurant community in DC today, it is still far more likely for white restaurant owners or business owners to get loans for their businesses, even if on paper they have the same exact credentials as Black business owners. So we've come a long way. Our society has made great changes, but we are still not operating on equal footing. And so what I try to do with my platform is make space for people who I know in my community likely face more barriers than other business owners, right? They likely do have trouble securing a location for their restaurant. They likely do have trouble securing a loan. And they often start with less capital, so less money to start with. And in food, what that means is that you have less money for marketing. You have less money to hire a public relations expert to help you get your business's name out there. You might, not have the money for similar technology or for someone to run your social media accounts to help promote your business. So when I look at my platform through Feed The Malik and I want to engage with local food, I do cover food from all sorts of makers, doers, owners, but I definitely try to make sure that I make space for highlighting and sharing the stories of Black people who may not have another space to share.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that very thoughtful response. I want to read you a comment that this is related to what you just said, a comment from YouTube user U.S.Embassy. He said he loves to see American food traditions, but he thinks when you say Black food tradition, you put race over others, and that it could be racist and contribute to dividing people based on the color of their skin. Well, I don't know if you've heard those kind of comments before, but how might you respond?
Of course. So a lot of people, even in the United States, don't like saying the word Black. We say African American, and we were long, taught that that's more polite. However, we in recent years have, seen a change in that Black peoples have said and have claimed that mantle for themselves. And talking about race, acknowledging that it exists, doesn't contribute to a racial divide, right? We have the data on the differences in access and outcomes in the United States along gender lines, racial lines. And we see that race still is an important factor in what people are able to accomplish in the United States and what access they have to certain services. And I truly believe that if we don't talk about race, then we will just continue to ignore those problems, right? I love my country. I love the opportunities America has offered to me. And I love that, we as a society are able to have these conversations so that we can do better in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that response. I'm curious your thoughts on, this is more of an American word probably than most of our Algerian audiences have heard, but there's lots of discussion, especially on social media and especially in food groups, about appropriation. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you could kind of describe to you what appropriation means. And I could ask it more specifically. Is it okay, for instance, for a white chef to cook traditionally Black foods and profit off of that, do you think?
So, if I operate from the premise that Black food is American food, then I would say, yeah, it's totally okay for a white chef to make that food and to profit off it. However, I do think that chefs should acknowledge where those food traditions come from that they are drawing on. So we see chefs throughout America make food from all sorts of cultures. You will see chefs make sushi, Japanese food, Southern food, which is, rooted in Black traditions, all sorts of foods that are not from their own heritage. And I don't necessarily see a problem with that. In food communities, we are always experimenting and tasting new things and trying to learn how to cook new things. But the line between appropriation and appreciation, I think, really lies with, does this chef give credit to where they found this idea, to the culture that this dish comes from? And that can be very simple. It can just be, one sentence on the menu even. It's very common for menus in the United States to talk about where they source their ingredients, to say, oh, we get our fish from here, because they want their customers to know that it's fresh. So I would say it's not much of a leap for that chef to also say, and this dish is my interpretation of a traditional dish from X culture.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Thanks for that. I like what you said about the line between appropriation and appreciation is often just recognizing where that food came from. I think that's really a good point. I'm curious, I know you've traveled a lot and you lived in Jordan. You mentioned earlier that you think that food is a great way to get to know a culture. So I'm wondering if you had any defining food experiences abroad, possibly when you lived in Jordan, that just really stuck with your mind and made you understand the culture in a new way.
I mean, I've had so many, and I would say this as someone who I'm very outgoing. And when I lived abroad and travel abroad as an American, I always try to meet people. I try to really get out of the bubble and just, experience the place. And so, for example, my mother and my mother-in-law came. So my mom and my husband's mother came to visit us in Jordan. And my husband and I both speak Arabic, and we both studied the Middle East. My husband's Iraqi American. So we took our moms on a tour of Jordan and Egypt. And it was amazing to see them experience the food and the culture, because especially my mom had never visited before. She didn't know anything about it. And so for her, it was like just this eye-opening experience where she got to see the richness of not only Jordan, but Egypt and the deep histories there. And we had everything from matluba to, even mansef. So it was a really incredible experience for her.
Do you have any tips for someone who's traveling to how to really make the most out of their food experience? For instance, if maybe some of our Algerian viewers might go to the US on vacation, what should they do to really capture the essence of American food and have a great food experience?
I would say skip most of the fancy places. And this is for when you're traveling to America, or if you're traveling somewhere else. You're going to read about these really fancy places that they get write-ups in magazines, and they probably do have amazing food, but they're just very expensive. And I would say that the best way to try to experience a local food culture is to find a restaurant that is family owned. We say in English, like a mom and pop shop. And usually what that means when you walk in is it's going to be pretty small and there's only a few tables, and the dad might run the kitchen and the son or the daughter might work the tables. And those are the types of experiences where you're going to basically taste someone's home cooking, even though it's in a restaurant. It's going to be much more affordable. And since the environment is usually much more casual, it's easier to ask questions. I found that it's much more comfortable in those environments to ask questions about, well, where does this dish come from? And, I see that you have this on the menu and I haven't seen that other places. Why is that? And when you're in those really casual, family-friendly environments, they're definitely going to chat with you and answer your questions.
That's a good point. And they're not going to chat with you and answer those questions if you're at a very fancy, busy restaurant. The celebrity chef is not going to come out of the kitchen to talk to you. So
not at all.
That's a really good point. So you're an influencer as well. I mean, you blog, you take really beautiful photos on your website. Maybe you can give some people some tips about if they were interested in doing something similar, if they were interested in being a food influencer, if there's anything that you've learned, any do's and don'ts. Is it okay to take pictures of your food in a restaurant?
Yeah, so I think that the number one key to being an influencer or a blogger, or I'd say a digital entrepreneur, anyone who wants to make a career online, because when you're doing it that way, you're really working for yourself, right? So there's very little structure. You don't have a boss. So my best tip is that you have to just approach the entire process as if you're going to be learning for the rest of your life. And if you approach it that way, it means that you'll continually ask questions. You will learn how to take the best photos you can with your phone. And then because you still want to learn more, maybe you'll experiment with buying just a small, really, simple, affordable light so that you can improve your photography that way. It is a constant learning process. And if you really just embrace it, then you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. Great. So it is okay to take pictures of your food and always be learning, always strive to find out kind of what you can do better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the digital environment changes so quickly that is, I think the trick is that no one is an expert, not even me. So you just have to kind of go for it and then try to do better next time.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you were writing a book that's being published by National Geographic. Congratulations. That's really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about the book?
The book is about the deep and enduring contributions of Black peoples to American cuisine. So I would say the talk I gave today has like tiny, tiny snippets from the book, but it's really a deep dive and a look at how from even before the founding of America as an independent nation, Black peoples have contributed to the development of the food that we enjoy here.
Thanks for that. We just have a question come in on YouTube from Mali Malu, who wants to know if Feed the Malik, does that mean feed the king? And where did you get the name for your blog from?
So Malik is my last name. And so it's a play on words, right? It does mean feed the king. But I wanted my name to be part of my, my company, my brand, because it is me. It's me by myself, learning about food and trying to share stories about food. And that's the best that I could come up with. But yes, my last name is Malik. And so I wanted that to be, part of the work that I do, especially as Malik was my father's name. And my father, even though it was his last name, it's something that in speech, people would often call him by his last name. And my father died 10 years ago and was very important to me. So I wanted to keep his name as part of my work.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Maybe you could also speak about the importance of a name. You have a brand at this point. What's the importance of finding a name for that brand? How important is having a good name for your blog, a good name for your platform?
So I think this is an interesting question because people focus on it a lot, and I've been asked this a lot. And my belief is that your name for your company should be important to you, and it should be relatively easy for people to write or say. But beyond that, it doesn't matter. Your work is going to speak for itself. The quality of your writing, your public speaking, anything you do, that's what's going to attract people. And your name for your company should really just be important to you.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Also, as someone who has a blog, I think the actual finding the name is less important than people think. So you shouldn't spend too much time on that when you're trying to get something off the ground.
Exactly.
We have a couple questions. Well, here's a question that just came in from Danver, Boston, who wants to know, well, you did touch on this earlier, but he wants to know some examples of soul food, especially as February is Black History Month. Could you possibly just sort of repeat what you said earlier about why you don't want to use the term soul food and why you use the term Black food and African-American food instead?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, soul food is a common term. People still use it, and but it has been stigmatized, right? And it's often associated with unhealthy foods of the Black community when, in fact, historical records show us that in the antebellum South and in the early South, there wasn't much separation between Black food traditions and white food traditions, for example. And so soul food, some people will say, is just Southern food by a different name. And it depends on your view on the soul food versus Southern food divide. But if you're looking for some of those traditional foods of the Black community, macaroni and cheese is definitely one of them. Cornbread, which I think is actually not something I've encountered much abroad at all, now that I think of it, but is really easy to make. So cornbread might be something you want to experiment with because it's relatively simple. It's basically almost like making a cake, except you make it with cornmeal, so ground corn instead of wheat flour. And then also collard greens are another, staple food in the Black community.
Thank you for that, for clarifying there. We have a fun question that just came in from Fareed A on YouTube. And he wants to know, was it scary leaving your previous job to try this new adventure? For those of us just joining in, Anela was a U.S. diplomat, and now she is a food blogger and writer based in Washington, D.C. So was it scary leaving that job to have this new adventure?
Oh, it was horrifyingly scary. I mean, the Foreign Service, being a U.S. diplomat, was an amazing job. And I loved it. I really did. And it's a job that has what we call job security, right? It's relatively stable. We have health insurance, which I didn't grow up in a household where we had access to health insurance or really healthcare. And it was everything I thought that I wanted. But I felt that I was being pushed almost, that there was something that I had to do and I couldn't keep putting it off. I couldn't keep saying no. And so I took a chance. And I mean, it could have ended horribly when I decided to leave. I didn't know whether I would be successful financially. I didn't know whether I was going to, get to write a book or do any of these things, but I took the chance and I'm really glad that I did. I will say I have a lot of privilege, right? I was able to quit a great job, but that's partially because I am married, and I knew, and I had talked to my husband, that if it didn't work out, he would be able to support us until I got another job.
Thank you for sharing with that. You took a leap of faith, but had some security in place, but still that's very bold to do what you did. Mali Malu just said on YouTube that she's eaten cornbread, or he's eaten cornbread. West Indians in the UK eat it.
Oh, interesting. So
that's interesting.
Well, that makes sense.
Shows you how
because there's a lot of culinary crossover between the West Indian communities and Black communities as well.
There you go. That is interesting. Another question from Fareed A. He wants to know how you find ingredients when traveling or when living abroad. I know for people who like to cook a lot, like myself, I'm on a constant quest to find local ingredients that I can use to make the foods that I like to make. But then I also sort of want to learn how to make new foods and discover new ingredients. So for you, how did you deal with finding ingredients when you lived abroad? So
I didn't cook much American food when I lived abroad because it can be really hard to find those ingredients and very expensive. In Jordan, you can get a lot of imported goods, but they were really pricey. And so what my husband and I both do is we try to make local foods. And at first we're really bad at it, right? Like I wasn't great at making bamia at first. And I'm probably not great at it now, but I learned. And you can, especially if you get local cookbooks, then they are going to have recipes using ingredients that you'll be able to find at the store. So that's kind of how we coped with that, because it was hard.
Yeah, I agree. And I think finding local people who really love food is important too. For a foodie to find someone else who's also a foodie and can share their food culture. I mean, they can come to your kitchen and help you cook things. It's a really
we learned the best things from our friends. It's always like the friends you meet who are like, oh, here, I'll show you how to do it. And you're like, oh, thank you.
Exactly. And that's a thing that there's no recipes for. And you're trying to be like, okay, how much do you do of this? But it's just I always find it's funny too. Every other country just has different measurements for things. It'll be like a handful or 2 fingers pinch or something like that. You know, when American recipes like almost always have very set specific teaspoons, tablespoons, cups.
Very exact recipes. Yes.
But that's part of the fun process. Okay, well, I think we are just all about out of time here. And I think that's all the questions that we have too. Anela Malik, thank you so much for being our guest today. It was so interesting to speak to you about African-American food traditions. Thank you for generously giving your time to talk to our Algerian audience about this. I hope you guys learned something about Black food traditions and just about the diversity of America and American food. I hope you guys really get the chance to try something that's not McDonald's, or no offense to McDonald's, but there's the whole world of American food out there. So thank you so much for your time. Do you want to say any last words?
No, I mean, this has been great, and I really appreciate the thoughtful questions.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. And thanks so much for everyone for tuning in. Please follow us on YouTube by hitting the follow button, or I'm sorry, the subscribe button. And we do talks like this every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Hope to see you guys again soon. Bye.